The trucks came at 7 in the morning, and by 7:15 half the road was standing at the fence line to watch. The Baumgartner strip, Earl Voss said, spitting into the ditch grass. Ada's putting money into the Baumgartner strip. Nobody argued with him, because nobody needed to. 14 acres of creek-bottom ground, gullied so deep in places a grown man could stand in the cuts and not be seen from the road, had sat empty and useless for 11 years. It flooded when the creek rose. It cracked like old china when it didn't. Old Baumgartner had tried corn on it twice before he died and lost both crops to the water, and every farmer on the road since had looked at that strip, the way you look at a tooth that needs pulling. Not today, maybe not this year, but someday, and never with hope. Ada Kessler stood at her own fence in a canvas coat too big for her shoulders, 81 years old, watching a flatbed unload 700 bundled saplings wrapped in wet burlap, and said nothing at all. Bare root pecans, Marge Talley said from the knot of women near the mailboxes, not unkindly, just tired the way people get tired of watching someone make a mistake. On that ground, Lord, what none of them knew, what Ada had never told a soul on that road, not even her own daughter, was what Harlon had written in the margin of a survey map 41 years old, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The notebook was on the kitchen table when she got back inside, where it had sat for 4 years since the funeral, and she did not open it. Not yet. She hung her coat on the peg by the door, the same peg it had hung on since before either of her children could walk, and she stood a moment in the kitchen, listening to the house do the thing it always did at that hour, ticking and settling, the refrigerator humming its one low note. 700 trees stood out there in the wet, waiting on her, and she was in no hurry, because she had waited 4 years already, and a few more minutes would not undo anything. Harlon Kessler had farmed the home place for 56 years and never once said he was afraid of anything, which was its own kind of lie, because there was one thing he'd been afraid of his whole life, that the creek bottom would keep eating ground until there was nothing left of the road worth farming. He'd drawn contour lines across a photostat of the county survey in 1984, the year the Baumgartner place first flooded bad, and written across the bottom margin in pencil, so light it had nearly vanished into the paper's grain, "Somebody ought to terrace that strip before it takes the road with it. Won't be me." Too old and too broke. He was 43 when he wrote it. He had a whole life left to live, and he wrote it anyway, the way a man writes down a worry he doesn't expect anyone to read. Etta found the map 3 months after he died, tucked inside a seed catalog from a company that had stopped existing before their daughter was born. She had sat at the table a long time with it in her lap, the furnace ticking, and she had not cried, because she had done all her crying already, in the weeks right after, in the barn where nobody could hear her over the cattle. What she felt instead, reading his cramped pencil hand, was something closer to a debt coming due. He had carried that worry 52 years and never once spoken it aloud to her, not at supper, not in bed, not on the porch on a summer evening when a man says most of what's really on his mind. He had only written it down once, young, and then gone on farming around it his whole life, the way people carry the thing they can't fix by simply not looking at it too directly. She was 77 then. She waited 4 years, not from fear, from arithmetic. A pecan tree wants 12 years before it bears anything worth calling a harvest, sometimes 15 on bottomland this poor. And she had done that math more than once lying awake, turning it over like a stone in her pocket she couldn't set down. 81 plus 12 was 93. She was under no illusion about her own chances. And she had buried enough people her own age in the last decade to know exactly what those chances were. "You're not planting it for you," her daughter Connie had said on the phone, "not a question." "No," Ada said. "I'm planting it for the road." That was the truest thing she knew how to say about it, and she said it once more to herself the morning the trees arrived, standing over the burlap bundles with a trowel in her coat pocket, and her husband's 40-year-old pencil lines folded in her breast pocket like a letter she hadn't finished reading. Roots don't ask how old the hands are that plant them, she thought. and did not know yet that she would think it again, worse, in the dark before this was over. She started at the low end of the strip, where the gullies ran deepest, because that was where Harlon's pencil marks told her to start, and because starting at the hardest place meant she would not talk herself out of the rest of it once her back began to ache. Terracing bottomland by hand is not romantic work. It is a mattock and a shovel and 11 acres of clay that fights you for every inch, that dries hard as brick by afternoon and sucks at a boot heel like something alive by morning after rain. Ada's hands, knuckles thickened by decades of canning and calving and clearing fence wire, went to blister and then to callus inside 2 weeks. She worked mornings before the heat climbed, cutting shallow contour berms across the slope the way the old Soil Conservation Service pamphlets from the 1930s had taught a whole generation of Dust Bowl farmers to do it, packing them with fieldstone and brush to slow the water and let it soak instead of run. She had read those pamphlets as a girl in her own father's kitchen, watching him trace the same kind of lines across his own worn-out ground with a stub of pencil, and she found now that her hands still remembered the rhythm of it, even when her mind had to relearn the words for it, how deep to set the stone footing, how far apart to space the swales so the water moved slow instead of pooling and rotting the roots above it. She worked with a transistor radio wedged in the fork of a fence post some mornings, turned down low, more for the company of a human voice than for the news it carried, and some mornings she worked in a silence so complete she could hear a hawk's wing beats overhead, and the particular hollow knock of her own mattock striking a buried fieldstone she'd have to dig around instead of through. 900 feet of terrace before she planted a single tree. Vern Tolliver, who leased the good ground on both sides of her place and had farmed it harder and flatter than his father ever had, drove by twice a week on his way to the elevator and slowed down each time, like a man rubbernecking a wreck he couldn't quite look away from. He finally stopped on a Thursday in April, window down, engine running, the smell of diesel drifting off his idling truck into the wet morning air. "You know that ground won't hold trees," he said. "Water table's too high half the year, and the other half it's near concrete. Baumgartner tried corn twice. Corn, Ada. If corn wouldn't take, pecans sure won't." "Pecans aren't corn," she said, not looking up from the berm she was tamping flat with the back of the mattock. "No," he said. "Pecans take 12 years to tell you you're wrong instead of 1. He said it almost gently, the way you'd tell a child something sad and true, and that was somehow worse than if he'd laughed outright. He drove on before she could answer, which was just as well, because she didn't have an answer yet that wasn't going to sound like grief-talking. And she didn't hand her grief out to men who leased land for a living and measured every acre by what it would return them come fall. She planted 700 trees that spring on 18-foot centers. Following the terrace lines Harlon had never gotten to draw with a shovel instead of a pencil, setting each bare root seedling in a hole, she dug deep enough to spread the taproot straight down without curling it, tamping the backfill in stages the way her father had taught her 60 some years before. Water, then soil, then water again, to knock the air pockets loose from around the roots. She planted a nurse crop of white clover between the rows the way the old pamphlet said, to hold the soil until the tree's roots could do it themselves, walking the rows afterward with a coffee can of seed slung on a cord around her neck, broadcasting it by hand in slow arcs the way she'd seeded a garden for 70 years. She kept a ledger in the back of Harlon's notebook, her handwriting small and even below his looser scrawl. Seedlings, $4.10 apiece from a native tree nursery 2 counties over, 640 of them making it through the first hard freeze that November, $2,800 and change, near enough. Plus the fieldstone she hauled herself in the bed of her own pickup and never priced, plus a summer of her own labor she didn't price either, because some ledgers aren't meant to balance in dollars. At the coffee cup on Main, where the roads men gathered most mornings before the heat, Ada's strip became a running fixture of conversation. Gentle at first, and then less gentle as the months passed with nothing to show for it, but bare switches of wood standing in mud and a scatter of low earthen berms that from the road looked like nothing at all, like a woman scratching lines in the dirt for no reason anybody could name. "She's out there every morning like it's church," Earl Voss said, stirring sugar into coffee he never finished. "Woman's 81, Ray Dunmore said. "Trees like that don't bear till she's 90-some, if they bear at all on that ground. She's planting a graveyard, not an orchard." Marge Talley, who ran the diner counter and liked Ada well enough to feel bad saying it, said the kindest version anybody managed, refilling a mug 2 stools down without being asked. "Some people just need something to tend to." After Harlon. "I understand it. I don't understand the pecans." Ray Dunmore's wife, June, who sold crop insurance out of a storefront office 2 doors down from the coffee cup and had seen more failed ventures than any 3 farmers on the road combined, put it plainer than anybody. "I wouldn't write a policy on that ground if she paid me double," she said, not to be cruel. Just stating what she believed was a fact of her trade. Some risks you don't insure, you just watch them happen. None of it reached Ada directly, the way small town talk rarely does reach the person it's about. But the road carries sound better than people think, especially across a creek bottom in the still of morning. And she heard enough of it secondhand from Connie, who heard it from her hairdresser, to know exactly what the consensus was. She did not change what she was doing. She added a 2nd row of clover for the bees that 2nd spring, mixed with a little vetch, because the county extension bulletin said pollinators liked a mixed nurse crop better than clover alone, and because there hadn't been a wild hive on that strip in a decade, and she wanted to see if she could bring one back to ground that had forgotten what it was to hum. She worked a 2nd full season of terracing that summer too, extending the contour lines up toward the higher ground at the strip's east edge, and it was there, sweating through a July afternoon with horseflies circling her ears, that she let herself say the thing out loud for the first time, to no one, to the ground itself. "Roots don't ask how old the hands are that plant them," she said, and the saying of it out loud in her own voice settled something in her chest that 4 years of silence had not managed to settle. That same week she taught herself to graft, working off a diagram in an old orchard manual she'd ordered through the county library's interloan desk. Because native pecan seedlings alone would take even longer to bear anything worth calling a crop, and grafted scionwood from a proven variety could shave years off the wait for whoever came after her to see it. She practiced on a dozen culled seedlings first, learning the whip and tongue cut by lamplight at the kitchen table before she trusted her hands to try it outdoors. The blade sharp enough to shave the hair off her own forearm, the cut made in one clean pull, so the cambium of scion and rootstock could meet without a ragged edge to rot. Her first attempts calloused over wrong, swollen and split, wasted wood she pulled and burned without ceremony. By the 8th try her hands remembered what her eyes had only just learned, and the graft took clean, wrapped tight in grafting tape, waxed at the joint against the weather. She marked each successful graft in the notebook with a small pencil check, the same soft gray pencil Harlon had used 40 years before, bought from the same hardware store that still carried the brand, for reasons nobody could explain. If you've ever kept working on something nobody believed in, you already know there's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person doing that. Not the quiet of doubt, but the quiet of somebody who has stopped needing to explain herself to anyone standing at the fence. The flood that broke her came in June of the 2nd year, and it came fast, the way creek bottom floods always do. 6 inches of rain in 11 hours off a stalled system nobody's radio had forecast right. The kind of rain that turns a familiar creek into something with a different voice entirely. Ada woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of it, a sound she'd known her whole married life. But wrong now, louder, closer, a sound like something tearing at the seams of the world. She stood at the fence in her nightgown and barn coat with a flashlight, rain coming sideways, and watched the beam catch water where there should have been ground. The whole low end of the strip under 8 inches of brown current, Her new-cut terraces breached in 3 places because the berms hadn't had time to knit their roots into the soil. Because 18 months isn't enough for fieldstone and brush to become a real wall against a flood like that one. She stood there long past the point of any use, rain running down her collar, because there was nothing to be done in the dark except watch, and watching felt like the least she owed the trees. In the morning light, she walked the strip and counted what was left. 210 trees, gone, torn out root and switch. Some of them found a quarter-mile downstream tangled in a neighbor's fence line days later. Most of them simply gone, swallowed whole by ground that had taken back what she'd tried to give it. Nearly a third of what she'd planted, undone in a single night while she slept the first 4 hours of it. She sat on the porch steps that morning with mud-dried gray on her hands and did not go inside for a long time. Connie called twice and she let it ring. When she finally walked the strip end to end, boots sucking at ground that had gone to soup overnight, she found the switchgrass roots she'd planted at the worst gully mouth the year before had held their small patch of bank even while the berm above it failed. A stubborn green fist of root clinging to 6 square feet of soil in the middle of a wound that stretched 40 feet wide on either side of it. She stood looking at that one small patch of holding ground for a long time before she went back to the house, because it was the only thing that morning that had told her anything worth hearing. That night, alone at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, and the house so quiet she could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off, she let herself think the thing she had not let herself think in 18 months of mornings. Maybe roots don't hold what worry can't. Maybe they just die where you plant them, same as everything else does eventually. And a woman 82 years old spends what's left of her strength proving the road right instead of proving it wrong. She looked at Harlon's pencil lines under the lamp and thought, for the first time since she'd found that map, that maybe he'd known something she hadn't wanted to hear all along, that he'd never gotten around to doing it not because life got in the way, but because some part of him had known it couldn't be done at all and had let himself off the hook with a worry instead of a plan. She did not sleep. Somewhere close to 4 in the morning, with the coffee gone cold beside her and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, she got the notebook out again and read the whole page once more. Not just the line about the strip, but the lines around it, the sketched contour marks, the little arrows showing where he thought the water wanted to go when it came up hard. And she saw it then, what she'd missed doing it in a hurry that first spring. He hadn't drawn straight berms. He'd drawn them curved, doubled back on themselves at the worst gully mouths, the way water moving fast needs more than one wall to slow it, the way a good levee doesn't stop a flood so much as argue with it, patiently, in stages. She'd built it close to right. Not right. She had read his handwriting and missed his actual thinking, the way you can love a person's words for 40 years and still not fully hear what they meant by them until the ground itself makes you go back and look again. She rebuilt that August, and this time she built it his way, doubled terraces at the gully mouths, packed deeper with stone she hauled up from the creek bed itself this time, instead of buying it trucked in, seeded with switchgrass roots instead of clover alone at the break points, because switchgrass sends its roots 8 feet down into ground like that and holds a bank the way nothing else in. That climate does. She replanted the lost 210 with money she hadn't meant to spend twice, dipping into a certificate of deposit she and Harlon had kept untouched since before he got sick, and she did not tell anyone on the road what the flood had cost her, in dollars or in anything else, because there is a kind of pity that cuts worse than mockery, and she had had enough of both to last her the rest of whatever years she had coming. "You look tired, Ada," Marge said one morning at the counter, setting down a coffee Ada hadn't ordered but drank anyway. "I am tired," Ada said. "I'm not stopping." Marge nodded slowly, the way a person nods at a fact rather than an argument, and refilled the mug before Ada had even emptied it, and said nothing else about the pecans that morning, which was its own small kindness. By the 3rd spring the trees she had left were leafing thick and green, the terraces standing through 2 ordinary spring rains without so much as a slump in the fresh-packed stone. Ruth Canby, who kept bees on the far side of the county road and had never once stopped to talk to Ada in 30 years of passing acquaintance, pulled her truck onto the shoulder one May morning because she'd seen the clover blooming solid gold across 11 acres from half a mile off and wanted to know who to ask about setting hives on shares. "Nobody's asked me anything about that ground in 3 years, except how soon I'd give up on it," Ada told her, leaning on the fence with her gloves still on, and Ruth laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her. "I'm not asking when you'll give up," Ruth said. "I'm asking if you mind 14,000 bees. I imagine they'll be better company than most of what stopped at that fence so far," Ada said. And that was the whole negotiation. Ruth set 6 hives at the field edge that summer on shares, painted white boxes humming low against the green rose, and by August Ada had her first jars, 11 of them, pale and clover sweet, the wax cappings smelling faintly of rain and cut grass when she pried them loose over the kitchen sink. She sold them at the church bake sale for $6 apiece before she'd even thought to mention where the honey came from, and every jar went inside 20 minutes. It was nothing, financially, $66 against 3 years and thousands spent and a flood that had nearly broken her. But it was the first thing that Strip had given back to anybody. And word of it moved down the road faster than any of the mockery ever had, the way good news about a stubborn old woman travels faster than bad news ever manages to. The second flood came that same summer, in early July, worse than the first by every measure the Weather Service kept. 9 inches in a night, the creek out of its banks by dawn and still rising through the morning. Brown water standing in yards a half-mile from any crossing. Half the road lost something. Culverts choked with debris and blew their headwalls. The low pasture on Vern Tolliver's leased ground, flat-farmed corner to corner, with no contour break in it anywhere, sheeted its topsoil straight into the road ditch, in a slow brown wave that closed the county road for 2 days, and left behind a scar of pale bare subsoil, where 80 acres of good black dirt had been the week before. Ada's Strip held. The doubled terraces did exactly what Harlan's pencil had drawn them to do. Caught the water, slowed it, let it soak instead of run, and where the switchgrass anchored the gully mouths, the banks didn't move an inch. She lost no trees. When the county soil conservation agent, a younger man named Dale Hereford, who'd never met her before that week, came out 3 days later to survey damage road by road for the emergency assessment, he stood at her fence for the better part of an hour, with a clipboard he stopped using after the first 10 minutes. And then he asked if he could bring students out that fall. Because in 20 years of doing that job, he had never seen dryland terracing done that clean on ground that bad. "Who taught you the contour work?" he asked. "This isn't textbook. This is old. My husband never got to build it," Ada said. "I just finished reading his handwriting. I'd like to see the original drawing sometime," Hereford said, "if you'd trust me with it." "I'll trust you with a copy," Ada said, and something in the way she said it made him smile instead of press her further, because he understood without being told that the original was not a document she meant to let out of the house, not for a soil survey, not for anybody. Vern Tolliver came to her fence the following week, not driving past this time, but parked, engine off, standing at the wire with his hat in his hand in a way she had not seen him stand in the 30 years she'd known him. His boots were still crusted with the pale subsoil his own field had traded for topsoil, and he looked, for the first time she could remember, like a man who had run out of certainty. "Road crew says your strip's the only thing on this creek that didn't move an ounce of dirt," he said. "Mine's in the ditch. All of it. 2 feet of good ground I'll never see again. And county's saying I've got to put in terracing of my own, or they'll site the runoff into the road." Ada looked at him a moment before she answered, and there was no triumph in it, only the tiredness of a woman who has been proven right the hard way and takes no pleasure at all in the cost of it. Hers or his. "Come by Saturday," she said. "I'll show you where Harlon drew the lines wrong the first time, so you don't waste 18 months in a flood finding that out same as I did. You can have what switchgrass root I've got to spare from thinning the rows, and I'll walk your ground with you if you want a second set of eyes." He stood there a moment longer, turning his hat in his hands. looking past her at the green rose standing steady in the July light. "I told you pecans take 12 years to prove you wrong," he said. "Quiet, same lesson," she said. Different tree. He came Saturday, and the Saturday after that, walking his own flooded acres with her, while she pointed out where the water had wanted to go all along if anybody had bothered to ask it. She showed him how to read the land the way Harlon had taught her to read it decades before, standing at the low corner of his ruined pasture and pointing with the flat of her hand at the barely visible swale running through what looked, to an untrained eye, like perfectly flat ground. "Water doesn't lie about where it wants to go," she told him. "It just waits for somebody to stop arguing with it." He wrote that down in a notebook of his own, a spiral-bound thing from the farm supply store, nothing like Harlan's soft leather one, but a start all the same. By fall, the county had a demonstration plot on the Tolliver ground built to Harlan's old contour lines, cost-shared through a conservation grant the extension agent helped Ada apply for, $4,000 toward materials. The first outside money that Strip had ever drawn to it, and Vern's 80 acres of flat corn ground got its first terracing in the 60 years his family had farmed it. The road did not flood badly again that year. The culvert at the low crossing, which had clogged and washed out twice in 3 summers, held both times the water came up hard that fall. And nobody on the road had to detour 20 minutes around by the highway the way they had the 2 years before. 3 years to the season after the flatbed trucks first unloaded burlap bundles at her fence, Ada stood at the same spot with Dale Hereford, 2 of his students down from the state college with a clipboard of soil samples, Ruth Camby's grandson helping check hive weights before the fall dearth, and Vern Tolliver's own boy learning to read a contour line off a photostat map. Because Vern had asked her to teach him the way Harlon had never gotten the chance to teach anyone. The trees stood shoulder high in most rows now, thick-leafed, years yet from bearing a single nut. And none of that mattered as much on that afternoon as the plain fact that the whole strip, all 14 acres of ground the road had written off for a decade, was green and quiet and holding steady under a sky that had dumped 9 inches of rain on it twice in 3 summers and found it standing both times. Earl Voss came by the strip last week, Marge told her at the counter that fall, not quite hiding her smile. Stood at the fence a good 10 minutes, didn't say a word to anybody, just looked. "What do you see?" Ada asked. "Trees, I expect," Marge said. "Same as the rest of us, finally." June Dunmore came by the strip too, that same fall, in her good office shoes she had no business wearing on wet ground, and stood at the fence a long while before she said anything at all. "I told you once I wouldn't insure this ground," she said finally. "I want you to know the company's changed its mind. Written 2 policies on creek bottom plantings this year already, both citing yours as the model. I don't know that I've ever been so glad to be wrong about a risk in 30 years of writing them." "You weren't wrong," Ada said. "It was a risk. It just paid. That was July." By the following spring, the Extension Office had put the Kessler Strip in its Regional Soil Conservation Handbook as a case study. Photographs of the doubled terraces printed alongside Harlan's original photostat map, which Ada had lent them to copy and asked back afterward. And 3 more farms along the creek had put in terracing of their own that winter. Following lines, Ada had walked out for them by hand, because she still knew the ground better than any survey drone the county could hire to fly it. Ruth's hives had grown to 14. The honey went for $8 a jar now, sold at the farm co-op under a plain label that said only Kessler Strip, Clover, not because Ada wanted her name on it, but because Ruth had insisted. And Ada had stopped fighting people who wanted to give her credit for something the ground itself had mostly done on its own once it was given the chance. She was 84 that spring, and she still walked the terrace lines most mornings before the heat climbed. Mattock over one shoulder out of habit more than need now. Checking the banks the way another woman might check on a sleeping child down the hall. The notebook stayed on the kitchen table, closed most days, its pencil lines gone soft as thread from 40-odd years of Harlan's folding and 4 more of her own hands opening it. She had stopped rereading it every night. She didn't need to anymore. She knew the lines by heart, the way you know a hymn you sang too many winters running to ever forget the tune, even long after the hymnal itself has gone to pieces in your hands. Vern Tolliver stopped by most weeks now, sometimes with a question about a bank that had started to slip on his own ground, sometimes with nothing but a thermos of coffee and no particular reason at all beyond wanting the company of somebody who understood what he was learning to see in his own dirt. Neither of them ever mentioned the morning he'd told her pecans would take 12 years to prove her wrong. He didn't need to say it again. She didn't need to hear it. The road had said it for both of them already, in the only language that road had ever really trusted. Not words, but what stood after the water went down, and what didn't. Dale Hereford's students came back that fall with soil probes, and a set of numbers that meant more to the county than to Ada, though she listened to all of it standing at the fence in her canvas coat while they read the figures off a tablet. Infiltration rates triple what the unterraced ground on either side of her managed. Organic matter climbing a full percentage point in 3 years, where the clover and switchgrass had done their slow work underground, out of sight, the whole time anybody had been calling it a graveyard from the road. One of the students, a girl not much older than Ada's own great-granddaughter, asked her how she'd known where to cut the first terrace line, out at the low end, before any of it had proven itself. "I didn't know," Ada told her. "My husband did. I just finally got around to reading what he wrote." The girl wrote that down too, in a notebook of her own, the way young people who are paying real attention tend to write down the sentence that matters more than any of the numbers. Ada would not live to crack the first pecan off those trees, and she had made her peace with that fact 3 years before anyone else on the road had even stopped laughing long enough to notice she wasn't planting for herself. She had known it the morning the trucks came, had done the arithmetic more than once lying awake in the dark beside a bed that had been half empty 4 years by then, and had planted anyway, because some ground doesn't ask to be farmed by the person who plants it. It asks only to be planted right, by someone willing to be wrong for a season or two, or a flood or two, on the way to getting it right. Roots don't ask how old the hands are that plant them, she thought again one evening that spring. Standing at the fence with the sun going down gold across 11 acres of clover and green switches of wood, taller than her own shoulder now, and this time the thought carried none of the darkness it had carried the night after the first flood, sitting alone at that kitchen table with the notebook open, and her faith in the whole undertaking down to its last thin thread. It just felt, finally, like a plain fact, the kind of thing a person could set down in a ledger and trust to hold its balance long after she was gone from the page herself. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth keeping from it. You don't always get to see what you plant come all the way in. But the ground remembers who did the work right, long after it's forgotten who stood at the fence and doubted, and sometimes that's the only kind of vindication a person needs, or gets, and it turns out to be enough. If you've ever kept faith with something nobody else believed in, tell us where you're listening from, and about the person who taught you to see value where everyone else saw a field nobody wanted. If this story found you today, consider sharing it with someone who's still out there planting something they might never see finished themselves. Whatever ground you're working, whatever season you're standing in the middle of, may it hold. May it forgive your first year of getting it wrong. And may somebody, someday, walk it after you and know exactly whose hands shaped it.